Hey guys, Naz here. So today I'm going to be taking you through how to make this little bumblebee here. He's made with quite a few different materials, but I'll be taking you through how to sort of work with each of them as we go. For the body you'll need some sort of faux fur. I just used luxury shag, which is like your generic sort of shag fur. All his brown sort of sections are just brown minky. His eyes were just a special sort of glittery fabric that I found at my local fabric store. You can sort of interchange it for any sort of dance fabric or anything like that you'd like. And for his wings, they're just a polyester organza. So you can sort of substitute a lot of these materials for others if you can't find them or want to use something else. But I'll take you through how I put him together. Patterning for this guy is a nice and easy method because we're going to be making it out of faux fur. Faux fur doesn't really have a stretch, so we can use the tape method to extract a pattern off an object. So I just went ahead, I printed out my bee sketch sort of to scale, and I sculpted all three portions of him out of clay. You can use even like a bunched up alfoil or something like that. Then once you've got all your shapes ready, it doesn't really matter what size they are, you sort of want something that's not too tiny. You're going to cover all of these shapes in cling film or cling wrap, and then you're going to cut a whole bunch of little pieces of duct tape or masking tape, and you're going to do about 3 layers, sort of trying to alternate the direction of the tape between the layers to cover all of these different shapes. Then we're going to mark all our seam lines that we want to cut on our bee. So I've just divided it in half lengthways, and then I've drawn on where I want all of the stripes to go, and I've made sure to definitely label all of them and add some little lines for registration marks. It can take a little bit of trial and error working out where exactly is the best place to put your seam lines, but sort of the areas with the most extreme curves are usually places that you want to add seams. So you can see here that I've extracted half of like the shell of our bee's body. I've marked where all the stripes need to be, and I'm just going to cut along all the lines that I've already drawn for colour changes. So I think it goes black, yellow, and after I've done that, you can see that some of these tape pieces still have curvature to them. So you then want to add extra seams, usually in the form of darts, and you want to just add those where pieces need to sort of be cut so that they can lay nice and flat. It doesn't have to lay perfectly flat, you can sort of manhandle it a little bit to force it flat, but you can see the first piece that I cut has quite an extreme curve. So I think I ended up adding 2 darts to that piece, but just cutting sort of along wherever there's an extreme curve until that piece will lay flat. So you can see here I'm just going to cut a dart and another dart, and you can see I can now push that piece relatively flat, and then we can scan that and use that to extract a pattern from. A lot of the time it can be better to add 2 smaller or 2 medium darts rather than 1 very large dart. This just helps really flatten out the area. Doing 1 very large dart can sometimes distort the pattern too much and it won't lay perfectly flat. So that's just a little thing that I've picked up over doing this a whole bunch of times. But once you've finished cutting out all your pieces, try and keep them all organised, obviously, because with the bee there's quite a fair amount of pieces because of all the stripes. You're going to scan these into your computer, and you can then go ahead and trace over them in whatever sort of program that you want to use. So I've scanned all my pieces and brought them into Photoshop. When you are scanning, you just want to keep in mind what DPI your printer is set at. So with a lot of my Photoshop files that I keep my patterns in, I try and set them to 150 DPI, and this just means that they're not such a huge image or file for my computer to store, but my printer scans in at 300 DPI, so I then need to adjust it to make sure that the scale is correct. You can see here that I'm just going ahead and tracing around all these pieces, making sure to transfer all of those little guidelines and just marking, numbers and things and what colour each of these pieces need to be. At the moment, we're just tracing them out at the scale that they are in real life. So obviously our bee is going to be much, much larger than the little clay bee that we made to extract this pattern from. So what we're going to do in a minute, once we've finished cleaning up and tracing everything, we'll then use just a little bit of math to work out what sort of multiplier we need to take a bee that's this length to turn it into a bee that's the final length that we want it to become. If you want to make any of these pieces out of Minky, all you have to do is bring it into a separate file, and you just need to change the width of these pieces, making sure that your nap is like going up and down. So you'd take it into another file, and then you would shrink your Minky pieces horizontally slightly, because that will account for the stretch that is going to occur when you sew it out of Minky versus faux fur that doesn't have a stretch. So I'm going to go ahead and start simplifying this pattern a little bit, because the less sewing that you have to do, the better. So if you've been watching my videos recently, one thing that I've been bringing up a lot is that if a seam is straight, so we have two sides of each bee here, so I've duplicated it and they meet at a straight line at the top. If your seam is a straight line, essentially it doesn't need to be there, so you can merge those pieces together. So you can see that I've merged the bands of the inner stripes of the bee at the top, so that just we're avoiding sewing that extra little straight seam at the top there. It just makes things a tiny bit easier for yourself, so you can always merge pieces together if they meet at a straight line. Obviously you can see like the thorax piece to the left here, that doesn't have a straight line, so you couldn't merge them. It's only on spots that have that straight line meeting spot. So the next thing we're going to do is we're going to combine all our pieces together that we want to upsize into our final bee. And we're going to be doing just a very basic algebra equation. I promise you, you guys will be fine. It's probably the only algebra that I actually remember from all my time at school, and I was pretty good at math at school, but not anymore. So I'm just bringing all of these pieces into a new document, and then we're going to work out what length our clay bee was. So I think it was 6.5 inches, and then we're going to work out what do we need to times 6.5 inches by to get our final length of 16 inches. I think I wanted the bee to be. So we're looking for y. So to work out, because y is the number that we need to times 6.5 to get so that's 16 inches. So all we need to do is bring the 6.5 over to the other side of the equal sign, and that times becomes divide. So y equals 16 divided by 6.5, and that is 2.5. So we need to upscale our bee pattern by 250% to make it 16 inches. And then I just went ahead and used Photoshop in a separate document to upscale it by that 250%. And now our pattern should be pretty accurately upscaled. It might be off just a teeny bit, but it should be pretty good. So now you can go ahead and print out all your pieces. You're going to get your faux fur all ready. So this is just a basic luxury shag in like a banana colour, but you can choose whatever colour you'd like. Then you go out and take your scissors and you're just going to cut all your pieces. I used to like using a blade to cut the back of the faux fur because you want to avoid cutting the actual fluffy parts, but I've sort of been practicing lately trying to just use a pair of scissors, and you just want to push it sort of under the backing of the faux fur, and you just want to take lots and lots of little snips so that you're avoiding cutting the fluff and you're just cutting the backing. So try not to give yourself too big of a seam allowance. It just depends on whether you're sewing with machine or by hand. I quite enjoy sewing faux fur by hand because I'm still a little bit new to it. But just give whatever seam allowance you feel comfortable with. If you're hand sewing, definitely a smaller seam allowance helps a lot. So for the legs, the pattern for the legs, I just traced over an image of a bee that I found, and that gave me a few different pieces that I needed to stitch out for the bee's legs. and instead of murdering myself by hand sewing all of them, I decided to digitize them in my embroidery software, and I'm going to take advantage of my big hoop here, and I actually had the embroidery machine sew out all of my leg pieces in one single hoop, which was very beneficial. So you're really just putting your stabilizer in the hoop, a cutaway stabilizer. Then you're spraying that stabilizer with some sort of adhesive spray. I use 505 basting spray. Then you're laying one layer of minky the wrong side down and sticking it onto that adhesive, and then you're going to lay another layer of minky right side down, so you're creating like a sandwich. And then I'm going ahead and I'm just having my machine stitch all of that out with a straight stitch, going around twice for each piece just to make sure it's nice and strong. And yeah, that just saves you guys a lot of time if you want to do that rather than manually sewing all of them, because there are a lot of pieces that go into the legs of the bee. You can certainly simplify them as well. You could print the pattern pieces out and then like stick them all together so it's just one continuous shape if you don't want to go to all that effort, because it is a fair bit of work not only to trace them, cut them out, sew them together, all that sort of thing, so it will take a fair while. But that's just something you can do if you've got an embroidery machine. You don't even need to have a really massive hoop. It would just, in my opinion, save a lot of time to sew as many of the legs in the hoop as possible. It just makes things nice and easy, and it's very satisfying. If you do sew all of your legs in the hoop, one thing I would do then is go ahead and cut away all the excess stabilizer off the back. You can see that I've just left it where the stitch lines are. And a little trick that I picked up when having to turn out these gazillion little leg pieces, because I only left a tiny gap to turn things inside out with, so I wouldn't have to do as much hand stitching, is instead of trying to turn it inside out using the tiny hole at the top, you want to get like forceps or tweezers or something like that, and you actually want to push it from the opposite end. So just grab the end and you're sort of pulling the rest of the piece over it like a sleeve and pushing rather than trying to sort of twist and turn and get it out that tiny opening at the opposite end. So I'll show you guys a little bit close up just so you can see what I'm doing, but this technique I found really helpful for any time that you're turning out inside out anything that's quite small and finicky. So you can see that I'm just pinching the bottom at the opposite end of where we're going to be pushing, and then using my fingers to sort of convince it to slide over the top of those tweezers and just pushing it all the way through. And you can get away with having a very small hole to turn inside out from, or turn out, you know, very long and skinny pieces. Like if you were doing a sort of long noodle shape, this is a much easier way, and you don't really need any specific tools other than like a pair of tweezers to grasp that pattern piece with. So for patterning the eyes, I started off by just tracing the outline of what a bee's eye looked like to me. So that's the piece on the left hand side. You can see that it's slightly asymmetrical. Then I wanted that piece to be flat, and then it's sort of domed out over the top. So I took 2/4 of a 4-piece circle pattern, and then I think the center one is just a straight circle pattern, and then you can see for the side of the bee's eye that bulges out a little bit more, I just modified that circle pattern, the piece that's marked L for left, and I just bulged it out a little bit at the top to match that base piece on the left hand side, and just made sure that those pieces lined up with each half of that base eye shape. And that gave me a really good sort of domed bee eye that still kept the silhouette of the left hand piece. And all you need to do is you need to sew all those together. So you would sew your half circle to your half circle, and then you would sew both of those pieces to the base bee eye shape, turn those inside out, and you can see I've cut some pieces of semi-rigid plastic. It's probably 1mm or so. You can use something like bookbinder plastic, or I just got this from the hardware store, and I'm just putting that inside the eye, and that's going to rest against that base shape that we want to stay flat, and then it'll just be our sort of circle quarter pieces that are going to bulge out and create that dome effect. So once we've put those plastic pieces in, we can go ahead and add a whole bunch of stuffing, and that's going to round out those dome pieces, and then we're going to have a nice domed bee eye shape, and it's also going to be nice and flat on the bottom so that we can hand sew it to our bee head. So I'm just making these out of minky because I'm then going to eventually cover them in like a dance type fabric or a sparkly fabric. You can choose to just leave these in minky. I think I ended up remaking these a little bit larger, so these eyes that you see here are a little bit smaller than the final eyes that I ended up using. And I also ended up doing some applique to put like a white sort of oval shape on the minky so that that would show up underneath the dance fabric, because that's a little bit sheer. So this is the fabric I initially wanted to use. I ended up going with the gold fabric because I just liked it a little bit better. This technique is sort of a little bit of working on the fly. So you want to lay your dance fabric on top, and then you want to get hot glue, and you're just going to be like pinching the dance fabric behind the eye and pressing it down into that glue and sort of trying to stretch it evenly over that domed surface of the eye so that you get like a really nice tight layer of that dance fabric without any wrinkles. I did this mostly because I really didn't want to have any seams of that dance fabric on the top of the eye. You can see like I'm just pinching areas, trying to get that domed surface as clean as possible. I don't know if it's possible to get it without any wrinkles at all, but you can sort of have the wrinkles so tiny that the faux fur on the face of the bee ends up hiding them, or they're really not very noticeable at all. So you can just really repeat this process with any fabric, or you could just leave them as minky eyes depending on what sort of look you want to go for. I'm just trimming away any excess fabric on that backing there, but obviously when you're using hot glue, yeah, be really careful. I think I burnt myself a couple of times, so I'm not the best example, but yeah, just be really careful not to burn yourself while you're pulling that fabric around the back. Or if you wanted to make things easy, you could just replicate the pattern for the bee eye in this dance fabric, but just make it so that it's a little bit smaller so that it would have to stretch nice and taut over the minky eye, and that would be a little bit easier, and that would be a way that you didn't have to use hot glue. But in the end I got a pretty good result, and then I ended up redoing these with the gold fabric just because I liked it a little bit better. So here you can see I've just taken the head and I've just pre-shaved it a little bit with scissors to make room for where the eyes are going to go, so you can just hold them against the head and then use scissors to trim it away. I think I did end up making the head bigger than this. This was an early version of the bee head, but you can also see that I've shaved the bottom of the sort of where the bee's mouth would be just to make it a little bit more well defined. Once you've gone ahead and you've sewn your final head out of the faux fur and you've finished up your eyes, you can just use a strong thread and a ladder stitch to attach the eyes onto the head. Just go around a few times to make sure it's nice and snug and secure. So for the bee's wings, we're going to need a product called Wash Away Vilene. So it's just a wash away stabilizer, and I prefer to use that over the Solvay types because this is sort of more like a mesh, and it doesn't rip when you have lots of little stitches going into it, which the Solvay can do if you're doing sort of thick satin stitching. So I've just done 2 layers of it because it is quite thin, but you can get it really nice and taut, kind of like a drum. So that's the overall goal. So I just needed 2 layers to do that. And what we're going to do is I've digitized the bee's wings, and I'm just doing the embroidery for the details on the bee's wings with my embroidery machine, but you could definitely do it with just a normal sewing machine using a satin stitch, like a dense zigzag stitch. But you can see here that I'm just going ahead and I'm stitching out a guideline for where the wings need to sit, just using a straight stitch. This is just going to show me where I need to stick down the wings. And I'm going to go ahead in a minute and I'm going to actually sew those polyester organza wings together using the pattern that I've provided, and that's just going to create our wings. I just used a basic straight stitch. You can sort of test out what works well for your machine sewing with that organza, because it can be a little bit tricky, but I just found having the straight stitch and then trimming the seam allowance quite tight against that straight stitch. I turned it inside out and I pressed it just gently using a pressing cloth and my iron on a very low setting just to flatten it out all nicely. Then I closed up the seam line or the little gap to turn things inside out. And then I went ahead and I used some 505 basting spray. I just did a little spritz on the wash away Vilene that you can see here, and then I pressed those wings down within the guidelines that we've stitched out straight here, and now they're all ready to do our decorative stitching on the top. So you can see here, this is what the wings look like once I've sewn them. The one on the left is before I've turned it inside out, and the one on the right is after I've turned it inside out. And again, I just went and pressed them to make them nice and flat. You also need to make sure that when you're doing this design that your bobbin thread is the same colour as the thread that you're going to be doing the top of the decorative stitching in, because we're doing our stitching on a see-through material. We're going to be able to see both sides of the embroidery. So I just used a dark brown here. You can see that I'm just putting these wings in place. I ended up having to forego, I think, maybe one line in the design, because they were really just meeting that outline. So I would even suggest sewing on the outside of that stitch line when you're sewing your organza wings, just making them a tiny bit too big if you're going to be doing the embroidery in an embroidery machine, just to make sure that none of those edges are curling up and getting too close to the edge of that design. But you don't need any sort of topper here, because there's no fluff like normally working with embroidery on Minky. So I'm just going to go ahead and I'm going to do all that stitch design, and that's going to look quite nice from both sides because we've got the brown thread on top and the brown thread on the bottom. There's two sets of 2 wings that come with this bee, so there's the large set and then the smaller set, and I realised that the large wings are probably going to be too big to fit in a lot of people's embroidery hoops. I'll include the files anyway, but if you don't have a hoop large enough to do the large wings, you could do 2 sets of the smaller wings, or you could just manually satin stitch this out on your sewing machine, which is definitely something that you can do. It just takes a little bit more work, but essentially it's the same process. So I didn't film me sewing all the faux fur bits of the bee together because it's just quite boring to watch, but I thought I'd show you how they all go together. So these 2 pieces make up each half of the head. So we have head front and head back. So you would have 4 of these pieces all up to make the head. So to assemble the head, you would just sew the head front and the head back together for each of your 2 pairs. And that would make like a half sphere kind of shape. So repeat that for both sides. And then you would have 2 pieces that kind of look like a circle, so you would sew all around to attach them. So you would sew the head front to the head front and the back to the back at the front seam and the back seam. You're going to essentially repeat the same thing for the thorax, which is like the centerpiece of the bee. So we have 2 pieces that make up each side. So you would obviously double this, so you would have 2 of the yellow and 2 of the black, and you would go ahead and sew up all those darts, and you would sew along that sort of center seam, and then you would repeat that for the other 2, and then you would sew the whole thing up like a big ball. And you would just have obviously your yellow piece meeting your yellow piece and your black piece meeting your black piece. So for the body, if you remember earlier, we combined the bands, the 2 central bands, so you can see like we've got 2 pieces, so 1 for each side, and we've merged them together at the top just so that we don't have to sew another seam. You would go ahead and sew those into like loops, so you would sew the top piece to the bottom of the same colour, so sew the yellow band to the end of the yellow band, the black band to the end of the black band. You can then go ahead and sew up your darts on those end pieces, and you would have 2 of each of those end pieces. They haven't been merged like we discussed earlier, and all you would do is sew those to each other, and then you're just really assembling the bands in order, sewing, you can just do 1 seam at a time if you'd like. So you have 2 of each of the butt pieces sewn together, 2 of each of the front pieces sewn together, and then you're just going to stitch those until you've got your bee. So now that we've got our bee, you can use a ladder stitch to attach the head to the body. I find hand stitching is a little bit of a pain when you're using faux fur, but you get sort of used to it. Now I'm going to measure the wire that we need to put inside the legs of our bee, because if we don't put wire in there, our legs are just going to be floppy noodles and they're really not going to resemble anything that looks like a bee. So I've just measured the length of the leg, and I'm also going to measure the width of the bee in the areas that I want the legs to be sticking out of. So I've just got these calipers here. You don't really need these, you can just guesstimate or use a ruler to sort of work out how wide your bee is at any given point. So we want to have our wire go from 1 foot all the way up the leg, through the bee and down through the leg and into the foot of the corresponding leg on the other side. So we're just going to use all those numbers to work out how long our pieces of wire need to be. Usually they turn out a little bit longer than they need to. You can just chop them a little bit shorter if it turns out that they're a little long. But I'm just going here and I'm marking out each of the points that I want the legs to come out of, and just trying to make sure that they're the same on each side. Because you don't want the legs really high on one side and really low on the other, sort of thing. So I'm just working out where visually they look the best. One thing that I learned, a little bee fact, is that all the legs come out of that central portion there. So you don't want your legs coming out of like the rear section of the bee, the large section. So I just sort of marked out evenly around the centre of the bee where that wire needs to go. Because our legs are so thin and small, I'm not going to be padding our wire here. I don't really think it's necessary. I just turn over the edges to make sure that there's no sharp points in the wire. And I'm just feeding them through to the other side, cutting that little hole. And you'll have 3 pieces of wire going through your bee and all ready to sort of press through those legs. It's like kind of like you're making a kebab, a meat kebab. You're poking it through those little leg pieces. You might need to cut additional holes in your little leg segments just to push the wire through and try and make them as small as possible, and that just means that there's less cleanup with doing a hand stitch. So here's what it looks like when all your little wire leggies are all in place. You can try and make sure that they're nice and centered so you don't have one leg that's massively longer than the other. And then you're just going to start threading in order all your leg pieces, so you can have them sort of bunched in different piles, and just bend the wire so it follows the curvature of our little leg pieces. So it might have a bit of a sharp angle at the top for some of them. I'm only using a thin fencing wire here. It doesn't really need to be massively thick because it's not going to be supporting any weight, it's just holding the shape of the legs nice and rigid. This bee isn't going to be able to stand up on its own legs. You would have to really work out how to sort of attach all of these wire pieces together so it was one sort of solid mass, and they weren't going to wiggle this way or that. And you would also need to counterbalance all that weight in the rear of the bee, so it would be a really massive mission to try and get this bee to stand up on his legs. You're welcome to try if you want, but I just had him sit on his tummy and his legs sort of splayed out on each side, and that looked quite nice. So that's just what we're doing here. So yeah, not very exciting, just going ahead and putting all those legs in place. You can see that I've even pinned the secondary leg portions to the first leg portions, and yeah, I'll just go ahead and pin all those together and trim any wire if necessary. I think I had to take about 1 inch off each of these pieces just to make sure that it fits snug into like the end of the feet on the bee. I use the same foot pattern for every single leg. I didn't really want to make things too complicated there, so they're all exactly the same. So once you've got all your leg pieces together, you can just go ahead and ladder stitch those together using a nice strung thread, which will take you approximately 1 million years because there's so many pieces to put together. So now I went ahead and I sewed up 2 strips. You can see in the wing pattern there's like a line at the top of each of them. I want to sew those lines or those top sections out of Minky, and you're only sewing the top and the front of the seam. You're leaving the bottom open. And what we're going to do here, kind of similar to my bat wing tutorial that I did a little while ago, is I'm pinching our organza piece in the bottom open seam, and I'm going to sew along that, and that's going to trap the organza in like this vein. I think you would call it a vein or a bone of the wing. So you can see here that by leaving the bottom open, I can sort of shimmy the organza piece up and into there as much as I can. I've pinned all of it, and now I'm going to go over the tedious process of I'm just going to hand stitch, just do a quick running stitch to pin all those pieces down. And then once you've done that little running stitch, you're going to take it over to your sewing machine and go over that stitch that you did with just a straight stitch on your sewing machine. You can go ahead and try and do that without doing the hand stitch first, but I find that it's a bit of a pain. You really do need to hand stitch it together first so that your pieces are lined up perfectly on each side. And now we have the bones of our wings that you can run some wire up into if you'd like. That just keeps them nice and rigid. And then you can put that wire, same as we did the legs, through one wing, through the body and into the other wing, and that keeps them sort of nice and connected. And you can see that when you move one side, it moves the other side of the wing. For the little stinger on the tail, that was quite simple. It's just sewing two of those stinger pieces together and then hand sewing it to the bum of the bee. And for his little antenna, I just traced over images of a bee antenna that I found online, and I put a tiny bit of wire in each of those, repeating the process. So it starts at one tip of the antenna, goes down through the head, up and into the other antenna, and you just hand sew those onto your little bee as well. So I hope this wasn't too complicated for you guys. I know there's a lot of elements that go into this bee, so if any of them confuse you and you need any help, don't hesitate to message me on Patreon or social media, and I'll try and answer any questions that you have. So it's not too hard to put together. You really just need to keep all your pieces organised because there's so many of your little leggies and all your different stripes. But yeah, I'm really happy with how this project came out. I've wanted to do this one for ages, so thank you guys for voting for it in the poll. And I hope you enjoyed it and had awesome holidays, and I'll see you in the next one. Bye!